Want to put a cross in my room? Okay. Only disclaimer is that my parents are great. Hope you find it funny. I still chuckle when I remember this. Setting. Many years ago, I was tilde 16 years old, living with my parents, recent atheist, all the long time doubter. After telling my parent that I'm an atheist, my mother put a cross and icon, religious painting, in my room. I asked her to remove it, but she wouldn't, saying something like, maybe it will make you more religious. I told her that while the cross and icon are in my room, I will read a passage from the Bible every day, out loud, so she can hear. And she was very happy to hear this. The next day, I googled, worst Bible verses, chose a short passage carefully, and read it from a physical Bible we had in the house. Her reaction was, this is in the Bible, and I showed her. Same thing happened the second day. The third day I went to pick up the Bible, she sighed and told me to get the icon and cross down, so Shekin put them in her room. And that was the end of it. And #X200B, edit. One of the passages was Genesis chapter 19 verse 8. Micromanaging my lunch break? Enjoy the extra paperwork. Hey folks! I have a story of malicious compliance that I think you'll appreciate. This happened at my previous job, where my manager was the definition of a micromanager. At this job, we had an hour for lunch, but the break room was small, so people usually staggered their lunch breaks. It was an unspoken rule that as long as you didn't take more than an hour and your work didn't suffer, no one really cared when you took your lunch. That was until our new manager, let's call him Dave, stepped in. Dave decided that he needed to control when everyone took their lunch breaks. He created asterisk schedule, assigning each person a specific lunch hour. My assigned time was right in the middle of my most productive part of the day, which was super frustrating. I decided to follow the new lunch schedule, but I also decided to take full advantage of my rights as an employee. You see, our company policy stated that any work done during our lunch break was considered overtime and needed to be compensated. So, I started to accidentally schedule meetings, calls, and tasks during my lunch break, making sure to meticulously document every minute of work ID. Then, at the end of the week, I'd submit a detailed overtime report to Dave, showing him all the extra work I did during my lunch hour. Dave was furious, but he couldn't deny my overtime requests without violating company policy. After a few weeks of paying me extra for work that I would have gladly done during my regular hours, Dave scrapped his strict lunch break schedule and let us go back to our old system. Fire me and remind me I can't work for a competitor in the private sector? Fine, but I've been reading and loving everyone's stories for the past few weeks. Thought it was my turn. Sorry that it's quite long. TLDR at the bottom. Many years back, I used to work for a medium-ish private tech company that does work for both government and private organizations in the education market. At the time, the founder was a wonderful guy who fostered a family atmosphere in the company. He treated us like his children, and we loved him like a first, second, third father. Depends how many fathers each person grew up with. Sadly, as in so many cases, things changed. The owner suffered a near-fatal accident and wasn't able to continue running the company. Everyone was devastated, but his family vowed to keep things going. However, they weren't as business-savvy as Ash was, and eventually had to hire someone else to run things. And as leadership changed, I think we went through 3 or 4 CEOs while I was there. The company became more and more corporate. Still, the employees continued on because we still believed in what we were doing. Now, I was a salaried, exempt employee. This was before changes in local labor laws formalized who could and who could not be exempt from overtime. It was generally an 8 to 5 job, but with bursts of unpaid overtime when things got crazy. I loved my manager, who always acted like a big brother and always had our backs. And I had plenty of friends amongst my coworkers. My job was to handle the technical implementation for one of our bigger and longest-lasting government clients. I knew the system inside and out, and did my best to ensure that the client had their expectations met while trying not to melt our systems. It was interesting work, and I learned a lot about both the tech we used and how the client's operations ran. Eventually, we got a new CEO who brought in their own top-level staff. And this bunch was as micromanagey as you can get. Our manager did his best to shield us, but cracks were starting to form. One by one, they started nitpicking and going after various employees, many of whom had been with the company for years. And my turn had finally come. Came back from lunch a few minutes late with my coworkers cause there was an accident snarling traffic? Noted. HR warned me about watching a video on my computer at work? Sorry, didn't know client presentations were off limits. Walked into the office half an hour late? My carpool buddy, who was pregnant, had morning sickness in the car. Yeah, that wasn't pretty. And just like so many others in this subreddit, they conveniently ignored any unpaid overtime worked throughout the year. Eventually, they built up enough evidence that I was called into a meeting with HR and my manager. When I walked in, I knew it was bad because my manager looked simultaneously outraged and sad. I was told that, due to my numerous infractions, that I was to be terminated immediately. Part of me was expecting this, since it had already happened to several others in much the same way, so I wasn't too surprised. As part of my termination, they reminded me that, per my original employment contract, I was not allowed to work for another company in the same educational technical service field, i.e., 104 direct competitors, for 5 years. A standard non-compete clause. I could of course work if it wasn't related to education or important for later, if it wasn't a private company. This was written back during the original owner's tenure. SWA wasn't as strict as other non-compete clauses were, so that was that. My carpool buddy was given permission to leave early, or she wouldn't have had a ride home later, and my service with the company ended. My coworkers were surprised and pissed, mostly because the company's reasons weren't that good, but also because the annual updates for my client were due in a few months. I had finished most of the work, but there was still stuff that needed to be done. And you'll probably all call me stupid, but I freely, emphasis on free, made myself available to my coworkers if they needed help. Why? Because I still liked all of them, and my manager, and didn't want them to suffer due to the actions of upper management. So where's my MC? Well, I tried to find a new job in a different tech sector, but it was slow going because much of my knowledge was SO education focused. However, one of the client managers I used to work with had found employment several years back with, you guessed it, the government client that I had been in charge of. And they just happened to have the perfect job for me, helping to implement a technical system that would replace what they had outsourced to my former employer. And since they aren't a private entity, it didn't violate my non-compete clause, so I was hired. And a few years later, my former employer was informed that their services were no longer needed. I was told by the rest of the implementation team that if it wasn't for all the knowledge I brought with me, it would have taken twice as long to get things done. And my old employer? They're still around. However, after losing roughly 40% of their revenue, they've unfortunately had to downsize quite a bit. I did manage to pull a few of my old coworkers in with me, and the rest found other jobs where they are more appreciated and better paid in many cases. Oh, and I'm salaried, non-exempt. Yay for paid overtime, part of a union, and as a final bonus, my commute is much shorter. Life is good. Tears of joy TL, DR, company fires me for petty reasons. Andre minds me I can't work for another private company in the same technical field. Didn't say anything about a government agency in the same field. Edit. A few people have pointed out thought non-compete clauses are void once you're terminated. So to add some perspective, I'm in Theus, so as expected the laws vary. I did a quick Google search and some states void it, some states allow it depending on the circumstances of the agreement in your termination. It's one of those things you would need to consult with a labor lawyer to figure out, but I wasn't going to do that. I looked at it more as a kick in the toe move out of an increasingly toxic workplace, at least as far as upper management was concerned, and find greener pastures elsewhere. Can't take lunch because of training? I don't think so. In my mid-20s I worked for a multinational accounting firm. I've always had a real firm policy for standing up when something doesn't sound right, irrelevant if it puts me in an awkward position. This story is how I maliciously complied and in turn made my director learn a lesson I hope she won't forget. We'll call her Karen, not her real name. Background on Karen. When she joined the team we all liked her, she made great changes and we got on well with her. But the moment she was promoted to director and had direct reporting to the partner, she flipped. Became a complete different person and made our life hell. Previously she spent her career heading up call centers, which was really evident in her management style, and for some reason made it her mission to cut costs in the team and gounder budget. This affected everything from telling us we didn't have a stationary budget for pins and had to take from other team stores to only allowing a one drink, one course policy on team dinner events. This was a huge company and other teams around us would go for fancy all expenses paid social events, so we felt pretty put out. Her cost cutting also extended to things like no overtime approvals unless way in advance. That didn't last long as we were understaffed so quickly emergencies weren't dealt with, and hiring school leavers instead of graduates as they were cheaper, despite the work needing more experience. Her favorite saying to everything was, "It's policy." Or blaming HR or higher-ups saying whatever new thing, even if a new irrelevant spreadsheet, would have come from HR. Honestly, the amount of time HR spent on our lil team in a company with 20k plus UK employees was astounding. Then came the day she booked an all-day training session from some external company to show us how to use a new system. She went on about it for weeks. was super excited that she had brought in this new system. The training was intense, so freaking technical, mind-numbing, and most of all expensive. So what would normally be covered over a few days was crammed into one full day. They were paid hourly. Shock. She sent an email advising how we're expected to attend. It will go through the whole day and lunch would be provided, but it will be a working lunches. Training would also be through lunch. Needless to say, the thought of sitting in a stuffy room for 8 hours without a lunch break wasn't appealing. I asked for an exception as I really relied on going outside for the hour at lunch for a break. I was in the midst of high anxiety at the time and my breaks got me through. She said it's policy that we would be expected to change our workday around to fit training, and there is no policy that requires her to allow me to go out. If I had an issue, I should check the HR manual. I think until now, this statement usually worked for her as no one really ever checked. I went one better. I went to HR. Cue malicious compliance. Using the effective wording of, "for my mental health and well-being," HR replied, and of course as agreed, as UK law mandates training as work on an 8-hour day requires at least 1 hour break, which I am allowed to choose what I do with. They CC'd Karen. Karen backed down but verbally told me it was an exception for me and to not share with the rest of the team. Of course I didn't comply. She was breaking the law. So I showed the email chain to everyone as they were complaining about the same thing. So me and the rest of the team came up with a little plan. Grin sandwiches were delivered. Budget sandwiches, of course, from the supermarket down the road. Instead of our slightly more expensive internal catering team who caters for this exact type of thing 4 or 10 floor building. I stood up and announced I was going on lunch and would be back in an hour. Cue the rest of the team, all 12, standing up after me. Karen goes, "Where are you all going?" To which someone replied, "You understand that HR said we were allowed to leave the room for the hour for lunch." The look on her face. She knew she was stuck. She couldn't say anything. We left her in there alone with the 2 trainers who seemed to guess something was up. I've never felt more satisfied in my life. We all had a good laugh about it outside. I think I even did a happy dance. She also knew she couldn't complain to Tom about it, as that would highlight her breaking the rules. I felt like I was walking on air all day. After this, there was much less blaming of HR, and generally she was a little skittish around me because she knew I didn't take her rap and would call her out. A second training session had to be booked since the training would never have worked in one day. There were lots of moans and groans about how expensive the extra training session costs. Of course, I left a couple of months afterwards, and so did pretty much the rest of my team, replaced by school leavers of course. But I'm very glad I complied. Smiling face. I believe Karen still works there, but for a much smaller team.